Hello, first graders. So today what we're going to do is we're going to look at the story of the White House and memorials and historic buildings. And what we're going to do today is we're going to look for things that are the same and things that are different. We are going to look at what's different and same, and then we're going to write about it in our writing block for today. So first, what we're going to do is we're going to listen to this story called The Story of the White House, and then we're going to look at the story called Memorials and Historic Buildings. Okay, as we're listening, we're going to pay attention to key details, so something that you learned.
The Story of the White House.
The White House in Washington, D.C. is home to the President, the First Family, and their pets. In 1791, George Washington chose the land for the new White House. However, he never lived there because it took many years to complete the mansion. Finally, in 1800, President John Adams and his family moved in. Many changes have taken place in the White House over the years. About 200 years ago, a fire burned much of the White House. Many rooms had to be rebuilt. The late 1800s brought major improvements. By 1853, bathrooms with hot and cold water made life easier for the president and his family.
Okay. So what is something that you learned here that is a key detail about the White House? So one thing I learned, and I think is the most important thing, is that I learned that the White House is home to the president, the first family, and their pets. I'm going to go ahead and highlight that so I can remember that. I'm also going to highlight George Washington because that's going to tell me who chose the land for the new White House. I also thought it was interesting that in 1800, John Adams and his family moved into the White House. And also that in 1853, bathrooms with hot and cold water made life a lot easier for the president and his family. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to read the next page.
In 1879, Rutherford Hayes was the first president to have a telephone. The White House telephone number was the number 1. Electric lights replaced gas lamps in 1891. President Harrison and his wife feared turning on the new lights. They were afraid the new lights were unsafe. In modern times, presidents have made important speeches over radio and on television. Today, the internet helps the president communicate with people all over the world. The White House even has a website. The future will bring even more improvements to the White House. What do you think they might be?
All right, so what is something that you learned about the White House, or what is a key detail that you remember? Good. So some people said, I heard that Rutherford B. Hayes was the first president to have a telephone. So I'm going to go ahead and highlight that so that we remember it. I also learned that electric lights came to the White House in 1891. So I'm going to go ahead and highlight that. And also that the internet helps the president communicate with the world, people all over the world. So what we're going to do now is we're going to look at the next story, and we're going to pay attention to key details there as well. Hello, first graders. It is Miss Chen. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to read the story called Memorials and Historic Buildings. It is a story that we're going to use throughout the week. If you have your packets, go ahead and find it, and we're going to read together with the author. So find this page, and let's start reading.
Introduction.
A memorial helps us remember the past. A memorial is a building or structure that honors important people and events. A historic building is notable and important. A historic building helps us learn about our country's past.
Chapter 1. Memorials to Presidents.
Mount Rushmore is a memorial to honor 4 presidents or leaders of the United States. Workers carved the faces of the presidents into the side of the mountain. Each face is about 18 meters or 60 feet long. These presidents also have memorials in Washington, D.C. George Washington was the first president. Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. Abraham Lincoln freed many enslaved people and kept the country united. Theodore Roosevelt helped to preserve our nation's parks and forests.
Chapter 2. Memorials to Brave Citizens.
The Minutemen fought during the American Revolutionary War. These citizens were ready to fight the British in a minute. A statue honors these soldiers. More than 150 years ago, brave men fought and died at the Alamo. The men fought for the independence or freedom of Texas. A statue honors these men.
Chapter 3. Historic Buildings.
The United States Capitol is a historic building in Washington, D.C. The members of Congress work here. They make the laws or rules for our country. The White House is the home of the President of the United States. The President also works here. Both of these buildings are more than 200 years old.
Conclusion.
Memorials honor special people from the past. Some memorials honor presidents. Other memorials honor brave citizens. Historic buildings are old, important buildings. These buildings help us learn about our country's past.
Hello, first graders. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to look at these two stories, and we're going to look at what is the same about the story of the White House and the memorials of the historic buildings. So one thing I remember that was the same was, what kind of stories were these? Were they nonfiction stories or were they fiction stories? That is right. They were both nonfiction stories. So I'm going to say nonfiction. And another thing I noticed that was the same was they both talked about the White House. And they also talked about somebody who lives in the White House, somebody that our school is named after. Yep, George Washington. So they both talked about George Washington. And they also talked about things that happened in the past. So I would say that they would talk about history. and history is stories about things that happened a long time ago. And both stories did that. Now let's think about what was different between these two stories. So one thing I noticed that was different was, did memorials and historic buildings, did they talk about just the White House, or did they talk about other things as well? That is right, they did talk about other things as well. They talked about a place called Mount Rushmore. They also talked about memorials to brave citizens. And remember, if I'm going too fast, you can always pause the video. Another thing that was different is that in memorials and historic buildings, it had these sentences underneath the pictures. So can you remember what the text feature is called if there's a sentence under the picture that tells you more about the picture? Starts with a C. Good, captions. So this one had captions and the other one did not have captions. And this one also had a text feature called Table of Contents. Now, the story of the White House, did it talk about only the White House, or did it talk about other buildings? Did it talk about other places in the country? No, so I'm going to say only talked about the White House. And it also had, it did not have captions. Did not have captions. And another thing that was different was that it had something called a timeline. Let me see if I can find it. So remember, this is a timeline. This story had a timeline, so we could go ahead and write that. And also, this story talked about things like the internet, which this story did not talk about. Okay, so I'm going to give you a couple seconds to read that, to copy that. And now what we're going to do is we're going to turn the page and we're going to look at this page now. Okay. So I'm going to fold it so that way you could see it better. what we're going to do is we're going to start with a topic sentence, and I'm going to try zooming in so that way you can see better. So a topic sentence, remember, is what we are going to tell the reader about. So topic sentence is a sentence that tells the reader what we're going to talk about. So our topic sentence is going to be about dinosaurs? No. We're going to talk about the two stories that we read. So I'm going to start with this week we read memorials and historic buildings. We also read about the White House. So notice that we're putting capital letters on these words here because that is the name of somebody and that is an important noun. Okay? And then what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about what was the same about both of these stories. So we're going to say something the same was and then we're going to look in our bubble map to see what was the same. So the same is these bubbles in the middle because these two are joining. So the four things that were the same were that they both were nonfiction, they both talked about the White House, they both talked about George Washington, they both were about history. So one thing we can say is that they were both same because they were both nonfiction, period. Something the same was they both talked about the White House. Something the same was they both talked about George Washington. Now, if you want to challenge yourself, and I would love for you to challenge yourself, is that you can write about two things that were the same. So you can say something that was the same was that they both were nonfiction and they talked about the White House. Okay. So now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about what was different. So here in the space, you're going to write what was the same. Now we're going to do something that was different. So something that was different is and we're going to look at our bubble map again. And here what we're going to do is we're going to look on this side and we're going to look on this side as to what was different. So something that was different is memorials and historic buildings had captions. Something that was different is the story of the White House had a timeline. Another idea is something different was memorials and historic buildings. Talked about Mount Rushmore. Something that was different was the story of the White House only talked about the White House. And again, I would love for you guys to challenge yourself and think about 2 things you can write about. So maybe something that was different was memorials and historic buildings had table of contents, but the story of the White House had a timeline. All right. Another idea for a challenge is maybe something that was different was memorials and historic buildings talked about Mount Rushmore, but the story of the White House only talked about the White House. All right. So I'm going to turn it over here again so you could see what you need to copy. And once again, if I'm going too fast, you can always pause the video. Don't forget your capital letters. Don't forget your periods. Don't forget to make sure that your sentences make sense. And don't worry too much about spelling. All right. Be safe, be great, and wash your hands. And I'll see you next week. Bye, guys.